Katangi tatiti, katangi takaka, katangi hoki koaho, te he moriora. Inga mana, inga reo. Ro rakatirama, tenakoto, tenakoto, tenakoto. Norera, ko waio, ko Harleen Hain, tako ingawa, ko te tumuaki o te whariwanaka o otako aho. Nā mihi nui kia koto, norera, tenakoto, tenakoto, tenatato katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Harleen Hain, and I have the amazing privilege of being the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago. And it gives me great pleasure to offer a few opening remarks at this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Hazel Tucker. Now, in the wake of what we've all experienced over the last week, Hazel's lecture is particularly poignant, and I personally applaud her bravery in agreeing to give it tonight as our university community begins to take our very first tentative steps towards a very new normal. On behalf of the university, I would particularly like to extend a very warm welcome to Hazel's family and friends who are here to support her this evening. Her partner, Rob, her son, Liam, her good friend, Donna, and Donna's parents, Faye and John, who have come here from Southland for the IPL to stand in for Hazel's parents, who are in Scotland and therefore cannot be here this evening. I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Ayud Nakaprasit, who is an ex-undergraduate student of Hazel's, who has traveled here from Thailand for the IPL. I'd also like to acknowledge your very generous contributions to the annual Tourism Field School in Thailand. Now, in addition to all of these special people, there are also other special people in the audience. And as I look out, I can see staff and students from around the university. We have our chancellor here with us this evening and members of the Wieden Dunedin community. To all of you, no mai, haramai, welcome. Now, as those of you who are regular attendees of these IPLs have heard me say many, many times, the path to professor is not an easy one. In order to receive this promotion, the individual must demonstrate excellence in teaching, in research, and in service to the university and to the wider community. Now, as you will learn from Hazel's lecture this evening, she is an effective and creative and motivating teacher. She's an outstanding researcher, and she has provided exemplary service to her department, to the university, and to the wider research community. So Hazel, on behalf of the University of Otago, it gives me great pleasure to congratulate you on your very well-deserved promotion to professor. And I will now call on the PVC of Commerce, Professor Robin Gould, to tell us just a little bit more about Hazel's journey to professor. Norera, tenakoto, tenakoto, tenatato, katoa.
Well, tenakoto, 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 katoa. Very, very warm welcome to you all here this evening. It really is wonderful to see you all here to celebrate and join in on the occasion of Hazel's fairly new title of Professor here at the University of Otago and the University of Otago Business School. So very warm congratulations, Hazel, and I'm very pleased to see you all here tonight. So just to begin with, a little bit about Hazel's background. So Professor Hazel Tucker, as she's now routinely referred to, came to the University of Otago from the UK, where she received, first of all, a BSc with honours in behavioural sciences from the University of Huddersfield in 1988, followed by an MA in anthropology from Durham University in 1995, and then a PhD also from Durham in 1999. Now, in 1989, shortly after her BSc, Professor Tucker took up a role as teacher of English as a foreign language in Turkey. And this stimulated a long-standing subsequent interest in research in Turkey, tracking long-term tourism development and social change in the Cappadocia region. This research has focused over the years on World Heritage values, rural community entrepreneurial development, gender and poverty alleviation, and tourism refugee interactions. She also, in the period after her initial visit to Turkey, taught English in Singapore and then in Japan before commencing her MA and PhD degrees at Durham. Now, Hazel here at Otago has served in various roles since joining us in 2000. She rose from initially lecturer, then senior lecturer, before in 2010 being promoted to associate professor. She served as head of department of tourism from 2012 for 3 years through 2015. And in the period since she's been here, she's supervised 25 PhD students, including currently around 6 of those students, 7 master's research students, and 18 dissertations in her time. So it's quite a hefty supervision load by any account. She's taught classes at undergraduate and postgraduate level, including development and teaching over the last 5 years of a 400 level, so that's a graduate level field school paper, taking classes to northern Thailand, which was just mentioned before, each time for 4 weeks a year. And this has also resulted in a book chapter on the use of ethnography for teaching and learning purposes. Now, Professor Tucker has a distinguished research career with multiple international collaborations. These include with researchers in China, at China's top university, that's Peking University, which also has involved a visiting fellowship at the New Zealand Centre. She's also worked with researchers in Japan, in Iran, the Netherlands, the UK, and of course Turkey. Her research has resulted in numerous publications, including her sole-authored book, Living with Tourism, Negotiating Identities in a Turkish Village, which was published by Routledge. She's edited 2 volumes of book chapters, including introductory chapters and concluding chapters, 23 book chapters, and 32 peer-reviewed journal articles. Now, it's this and other work, along with the work of her colleagues, that has helped build the stunning reputation of our tourism department here in the business school at the University of Otago, which sits somewhere, depending upon which rankings you look at, between about 5th and 15th in the world. So we're very, very proud of that department. And it's also one of only 3 World Leisure Organization centres of excellence and the only one in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, Professor Tucker's work has gained significant international recognition. She's been invited as an earmark of that, and given 8 conference keynote addresses at international conferences in countries from Turkey through Scandinavia and the UK and so forth. She serves on the advisory board of 9 international academic journals and is also associate editor of the Annals of Tourism Research, which is amongst the highest ranked and a leading international journal in the field. Now, Hazel's work has increasingly focused on questions of sustainability and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And starting this year, Hazel's taken on an important role as leader for the Otago Business School for its strategic imperative, which commits us to being a local, national and global citizen. Now, this is one of our 7 strategic imperatives and demonstrates commitment to ensuring that our teaching, research and service reflect the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Now, tonight, Hazel is going to explore how tourism affects or may affect our capacity for hope. This is particularly important and a very timely question, as the Vice-Chancellor has pointed out, for all of us here this evening, given the events of recent days. And it's a question through which we need to ask what tools we can use to build a more compassionate and inclusive society, tourism being one of those. So Hazel will be exploring, amongst other questions, how tourism creates a hopeful mood or orientation towards the future. So Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, academic staff, and those of you here in the audience tonight, Professor Hazel Tucker will now give her presentation, Shame, Empathy, Fear and Hope, Why Tourism Matters. So I invite Professor Tucker up now to address you all.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Harleen and Robin, if I may. And I'd also like to say hello to anybody that's watching in from elsewhere, possibly George and Amy in Guangzhou, and Jasmine in Sweden, if you managed to get up in time. I think most people in that part of the world decided that it was a bit too early to get up for this, so we'll forgive them, and hello when you watch it later. Just a word, first of all, on the title here. So I had to submit the title for my IPL a good 3 or 4 weeks ago so that it could be advertised and so on. And so I played around with a few different titles, first of all, and my initial title that I was going to go with was much more vague, would have given me much more room to play with at this point in time. But Liam, my son, told me that it was a sort of nerdy anthropologist title and that I ought to give, thank you, Liam, have something a bit more specific. And so I ended up with this title. And so I've committed myself to talking about this stuff tonight. And as alluded to by both Harleen and Robin, as it turns out, the title and the subject matter is extremely poignant at this particular point in time. And in fact, there was a brief discussion mid last week about whether we should postpone the IPL because of that sort of, it was almost too poignant. But as a colleague quite rightly said to me, when would a time be when these issues were not too urgently poignant? So we decided to go ahead and to persevere with it. And so I am going to be talking about shame, empathy, fear, and hope. And I'm going to tell you about the key ideas in my work that have related to these things. And I'm going to use examples along the way, both from my Turkey research and from New Zealand research. And I'm also going to tell a few personal anecdotes to illustrate as well. Because of the relevance of these matters to what's happening here in New Zealand and beyond right now, I've had a bit of trouble during the last few days sort of deciding exactly what to say and how to say it. And I've ended up sort of rewriting bits and pieces over and over again, which has driven Rob and Liam a bit mad, I think. So I'm going to stick to my notes fairly closely because I want to get it right, I guess. And sometimes I will make direct reference to these broader relevances, and sometimes I'll let you infer those relevances. So before I get into my work on shame and empathy and hope and so on, I'll quickly give 2 levels of introduction to my work. And the first introduction that I'll give is a sort of broader, brief introduction around tourism. So this is especially for the non-tourism specialist members of the audience. So first of all, a sort of important point is that tourism is said to be one of the world's largest industries. And so internationally and nationally here, as I'm sure you know, it's a very important promoter of economic growth and development, as well as a massive job producer and so on. So according to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, this is mainly why tourism matters. But this represents only one way of thinking about tourism, albeit a highly mainstream, sort of dominant one. And as I see it, tourism is much, much more than this. So for me, actually, the key words in that quote from the UNWTO are tourism is large, very large, in fact, and it's getting larger all the time. And the stats tell us that there are now around 1.5 billion international tourist trips per year in the world, let alone the number of domestic tourists travelling around in many countries. So as well as being an industry, tourism is also a massive movement of people and a massive series of encounters. People encountering other places and people encountering other people. And this notion of encounters with other people and places has grown in poignancy this week. Because tourism could be said to be premised on difference, or on experiencing different or other places, peoples, landscapes, cultures, foods, weather, and so on. In tourism, places and peoples are often represented as extraordinary, whereas in fact, they are ordinary. And so this is where my work fits in as an anthropologist. Over the course of my career, I've been interested in tourism encounters and the various ways in which tourism, through these encounters, is implicated in and kind of acts or does things in relation to the social, cultural, and even the moral fabric of society. And I see these implications and acts as always multi-layered, complex, and mostly not measurable or reducible to simple positives and negatives. And one particular layer in this complexity that I've paid attention to in my research is the affective or emotional dimensions of tourism. And so that's what I'm going to focus on this evening, and especially on these four, shame, empathy, fear, and hope. And so I'll keep these in a sidebar here as pointers along the way so that you know where we are. And so that you know when we're getting down the list and close to going to the staff club. And also as a reminder that all of these terms ultimately link with or lead to the important matter of hope. But before I get onto this list, and because my IPL is meant to tell you the story of something about the story of my research career from the beginning through to professor, I'm going to firstly give you a bit of background on when and how I first got into all of this stuff. And I guess a lot of people at this point might sort of start their research career story at the point of their master's or PhD. But I think that my research story begins quite a bit before that, before my postgrad studies. And I've sort of traced it back to thinking, so when did this start? And I think I traced it back to, I've sort of hit on the point, and that was a pivotal moment in 1984. That's the year, not the book, when I was a teenager and I met a German hippie, or hippie German, I don't know which way round you. So in the common room of a youth hostel in central Athens. And the German hippie had just had his Kodak film developed in a Photoshop down the road. And looking around the room, there's only a few of you that won't understand what I just said. If that's all right. And he was keen to show us his photos, me and my friends. And in the photos was a place he'd travelled to just before coming to Athens, and it was the village of Gurame in an area of central Turkey called Cappadocia. He told us that the place was amazing and we should definitely go there too. But Turkey wasn't a place that tourists went to at that time, and so we were extremely hesitant. But the hippie told us that the people were incredibly friendly and wonderful, and I guess in the end he somehow persuaded us, because the next day, and there's a map so that you can see Athens over there in the green bit, Greece. The next day, we got onto the road heading north out of Athens, and we stuck out our thumbs, and with a few bumpy adventures along the way, we hitchhiked our way around to Istanbul, and then we made our way through to Göreme. And there, when we arrived in Göreme, in Cappadocia, we were met with this magical, bizarre, moon-like landscape of these giant cones called fairy chimneys. And Göreme itself was a dusty village with cave houses built in amongst these fairy chimneys. And there was no tourism then, so we put our little tent up on a piece of scrubland in the middle of the village, and then we hung out for a few days. And so that's where it started. Basically, I developed a love for the place from that point. And then I went back a few times in the later part of the 1980s when I was teaching English as a foreign language in Izmir. And by that time, at the end of the 80s, Göreme village was beginning to develop a little bit of backpacker tourism. And so then when I was doing my postgrad studies in anthropology at Durham in the 1990s, I decided to look at Göreme and the wider Cappadocia region as a case study of tourism development and social change. I lived in Göreme for a year and a half to do my PhD research, and that was later published as the book up there, Living with Tourism. And since then, I've continued this longitudinal study tracking tourism and change over now 30-odd years in this one area, which is both a national park and a World Heritage Site. So I've seen the area develop from having pretty much no tourism business at all in the early 1980s to developing backpacker guest houses and small restaurants in the 80s and 90s, and then developing hot air balloon tourism in the 2000s. And it was, I think, the hot air balloon tourism which really sort of set things off changing, because the balloons above the landscape are so photographed now that Göreme's fame on the sort of world stage of destinations has grown and grown. And you may have seen Göreme in programs that Michael Palin have done. He's been there. Joanna Lumley, she's been there, her program just recently shown. Famous Chinese pop stars have been there. And so now Göreme, the picture there with all the balloons there, it's for Instagram. It's become an Instagram sensation. And when I last visited, which was in October last year, conversations I had with people there made me wonder if development has now sort of started tipping over into the state of what we're now calling over-tourism. So in Göreme, the same village that we put our tent up in 1984, there are now over 300 hotels and over 130 restaurants. Authorities have limited, for safety reasons, the number of hot air balloons that can fly above Göreme each morning to 150 hot air balloons. And even though the baskets they're using are getting bigger and bigger and able to carry about 20 to 30 people, at the same time, it's still difficult to get a ballooning ticket because they're always full. So Göreme has given me heaps of material to work with over the years, and I've published on many different aspects of tourism and change there, but always looking at what the change there in this place can tell us about broader issues in tourism studies, such as things that Robin mentioned, community-based tourism and sustainability, and how World Heritage and local community values connect or not, gender and women's work, identity, hospitality, relationships, entrepreneurship, and so on. More recently, looking at, at refugee tourism interactions with Turkey now being having the largest refugee population in the world. So also, somewhere along the line, I started doing research and writing about the topic of shame in this research. So we're now coming to the first item in the sidebar. And I've looked at shame in two quite different ways. One way is in relation to the strand of my work looking at gender relations, and I'll tell you about the other way after. So first of all, I'm going to start with that work on shame and gender relations in Gurame. In my earlier research on tourism in Cappadocia, I outlined how life in this part of Turkey, which can be considered quite socially conservative, is strongly gendered. And in short, a gender spatial separation operates there between public and domestic space, which is upheld through a system of honour and shame. So as tourism started to develop in the area in the 80s and 90s, women were largely separated from tourists and tourism activity, so that tourism business became almost entirely the domain of men. But through my longitudinal research, I've observed how the gender situation there has gradually changed. And during the past 15 years or so, particularly, more and more women have got work in the hotels and guest houses, and some women have also started entrepreneurial activities such as making and selling jewellery to tourists, running cafes and restaurants, or offering Turkish cooking classes in their cave homes, for example. And so through all of this, local women have come to be more visible in Gurame's public spaces, such as the main street and the shops and the cafes in that area. And as I've written in one of my articles on this, all of this has entailed the undoing of shame in terms of the honour-shame system. And while other aspects of social change will probably have played a part in this, I sort of conclude in this research that tourism has largely been responsible for this gradual undoing of shame. And in fact, tourism has shifted the spatial and moral boundaries to such an extent in Gurame now that there's almost a reversal in career and livelihood prospects for young men and women. This is because the increased wealth from tourism, together with the undoing of shame that previously restricted girls and women from going away from their homes, has meant that families have been sending their daughters, as well as their sons, to high school. And because many boys and young men are choosing the sort of easily available road of tourism and dropping out of school early, it's the girls and young women who are becoming better educated and now pursuing careers such as teaching, nursing, translating, and engineering. And so while my own particular research on this is based mainly around this one area, it has wider applicability because the pattern of gender, this sort of same pattern of gender inequality, is repeated in many tourism contexts all over the world. It's for that reason that tourism development agencies such as the World Bank often deliberately promote women in tourism projects. But what my work has shown, together with case studies conducted by my PhD students in other parts of the world, is the enormous complexity of what's involved in this kind of change. And so in this article here, in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, Brenda Boonabana and I warn that whilst well-intentioned, many such development projects and interventions which are often underpinned by Eurocentric ideas about women's empowerment and how Western ideas about how gender relations ought to be, these projects may lack sufficient understanding of the specific cultural context that they're working in. So that's the first area of sort of connection with shame that I've looked at. Now on to another very different link between shame and tourism that I've written about. And this was prompted when I started to examine during my fieldwork in Gurumeh what I observed as uncomfortable tourism encounters. I'm not really interested in comfortable tourism encounters. I'm more interested in uncomfortable tourism encounters. This has led me to become interested in tourism's capacity to prompt feelings of shame or to produce a heightened, shameful awareness of the tourist self. An example might be where tourists, for example, might catch themselves trying to bargain the price down at a market when they know that the meagre amount that they're trying to reduce the cost by is nothing to them, but it's likely worth much more to the seller. Or another example is where tourists might shamefully notice themselves objectifying or even romanticizing poverty. And in this research, and this article in particular, I draw on the work of an Australian cultural studies scholar, Elspeth Proban, who points out that shame can be productive. It can be a productive emotion because it illuminates our interest in living ethically. So in this linking of shame, instead of viewing shame as something to be undone, I consider shame as potentially productive in its reflexive and self-evaluative role, disrupting an often inherently colonial relationship between tourist and other, and potentially prompting a kind of dispositional change in a desire not to carry on repeating injustices. Tourism encounters, I think, can often create a kind of an interesting kind of mirror effect, where in each party's encountering of the other, they also see themselves. And this can occur both at the level of the individual and at the societal level, I think. An example, an uncomfortable example, especially right now, is what occurred here a few months ago following the murder of British tourist Grace Mullane. The fact that Grace was a tourist here when she was murdered, I think, was significant in the reactions around New Zealand that it prompted, and the word shame was quite prominent at that time, as in this article from the ODT. At the vigil for Grace held in the Octagon, for example, Dave Cull, the mayor here, said that he felt shame, bitter, deep shame. And I think that it was particularly sort of the tourism context of this that through tourism's tendency to create this mirror effect that led to this strong sense of shame and self-evaluation sort of being produced, which in turn then led to a widespread call to action against this kind of violence against women, particularly. To quote Elspeth Proban again, shame can be particularly productive because it indicates a rethinking of, and I quote, how we wish to live in proximity to others. And so then this links very closely, I think, with the matter of empathy. In relation to empathy is the question of whether tourism can be, as is suggested by some in the tourism literature, a force for cross-cultural understanding, empathy, and peace. And this, of course, is based on the idea that tourism and travel provide opportunities to learn about other places and peoples. And while my research in this area and in this article particularly, I sort of quite strongly interrogate this idea and question it. And certainly I'm sort of strongly questioning of the idea that tourism may enable an ability to truly imagine what it would be like to walk in another's shoes. My conclusion from examining a wide variety of ways in which tourism might promote empathy is that tourism encounters, by placing you there in proximity and in relation to others, can be productive, to use that word again, in rethinking how we wish to live in proximity to others. And I'm going to give you tell you a short anecdote to illustrate this point. And this anecdote, this story, is from a few years ago when I was traveling in Europe with Rob and Liam. And it was late in the summer of 2015, and we were traveling from Turkey up through Europe to go to the UK. And we found ourselves following the main refugee route, as many refugees, mainly Syrians at that point, were trying to make their way up to Germany or elsewhere in Northern Europe. At one point, we stayed overnight at a hotel on the German side of a river, which marked the Austrian-German border. And that evening, we walked across the bridge because the hotel owner told us that there was nowhere to get anything to eat on the German side, and that we had to go over to the town on the Austrian side. So we walked across the bridge to get a meal. And when we returned after our meal, we saw many refugee families gathered at the police checkpoint on the bridge, waiting to be processed for their arrival into Germany. And Liam was he was 10 at the time of that encounter. I do have his permission to tell you the story. And it was interesting how he recalled the scene when about 2 years later he was having an email conversation with his granddad about the care being taken to resettle refugees coming into New Zealand. During the conversation, he told his granddad of our refugee encounter on the Austrian-German border. And there were two main stories within his bigger story. One of the stories was how the large crowd of refugees who were gathered on the bridge by the German police let off balloons in order to, in Liam's words, celebrate their arrival and the start of their new life in Germany. His other story told that relative to the Syrian families on the bridge, we, as in our family, were able to walk back and forth across the bridge, coming and going between Austria and Germany, and that we didn't need our passports, and that the police on the bridge just ignored us. And of course, I can't really know what effects these kinds of experiences might have on Liam as he grows older. But this encounter did appear to create some sort of awareness of his own life situation relative to others. And it also seemed to prompt for him some important, kind of bigger than himself questions, such as who has passports and who can travel, and under what circumstances can they travel. I therefore like to think that these kinds of trips and encounters that we expose Liam to as mini versions of world schooling, as it's called in tourism literature, where families take their children out of school and travel the world, viewing the world as their classroom in order specifically to develop cross-cultural understanding and empathy. But of course, not all tourism does this. As I've seen more recently during a research project I've conducted with Chinese tourists in New Zealand, for example. At times, tourism may even have the opposite effect and actually increase intolerance, disrespect, and othering among groups of people. And as Paul Hunt, the Human Rights Commissioner, said at his talk here last Thursday, it's this othering that can all too easily lead to the type of terrible violence that occurred in Christchurch 10 days ago. And so, on the matter of empathy, and with a renewed relevance, some important questions about tourism that I think that we need to keep pursuing are: when and how does tourism incite intolerance and add to othering by strengthening notions of difference? And conversely, under what conditions can tourism enable cross-cultural understanding, togetherness, and a sense of sameness? So, now, to move on to something completely different, but still somehow related. And I'm going down the list here. And so now on to the word fear in the list. And here I'm going to talk about my research on the links between tourism and a big kind of fear, which is an apocalyptic fear for the future. And again, I'm going to illustrate with an anecdote, this time from Safranbolu, which is a World Heritage town in the north of Turkey. And we visited again with Robin Liam and I a few years ago again. And when we were there, we met an elderly man in Demirciler Sokak, which roughly translates as Metalworkers Street. So we wandered into the man's workshop, and he said that he was making himself a Turkish coffee, and he offered us one. We accepted, and so then we chatted while he made the coffee on his small stove. He told us that he'd been welding brackets there since he was 17, and he also earned a bit of money from folk dancing because he belonged to a regional folk dancing group, and they dance at weddings and sometimes at official events such as World Heritage meetings, for example. I asked him about what he saw of the future of the Metalworkers Street, and he said that young people these days don't want to do this kind of work because it's too hard. He said he'd asked his son to come to the workshop to learn his trade, but he didn't want to come. Young people don't like work, he said, and would rather spend their time on their computer or phone. I translated this to Liam, who was sitting beside me, and he rolled his eyes. The old man then said that he feels sad and scared that because the young people don't want to do these trades, when elderly people like him die, these arts will be lost. Another conversation that I had in Safranbolu was with a family from Ankara with 2 young children who'd come to Ankara to visit Safranbolu for the weekend. The parents said that the town represented for them a pastime when people walked around together. There was more kindness, politeness, respect, closer relationships. It was a closer community then, they said, and that doesn't exist anymore. So fearful of the kind of world that their children are growing up in, they said that they wanted to take their children to visit Safranbolu because it would help them not to forget what life used to be like. So there's an idea here that World Heritage status and the term, the tourism that comes with that has somehow saved the town of Safranbolu, from falling into ruin. And it's saved the traditional way of life from disappearing, or at least saving it from disappearing quite as quickly as it otherwise might have done. But I think that this kind of heritage tourism creates a kind of apocalyptic aesthetic illusion in a similar way to the faces vase illusion, and also illustrated in this lovely picture which Liam took, thanks Liam, of Safranbolu town tinted golden yellow through saffron tea. When looking at these pictures, just as the appearance of the faces always seeps into your view of the vase, the state of the world outside of the World Heritage Site of Safranbolu always seeps into your tourist experience when in Safranbolu, bringing the decline of what is good in the world into stark relief and imbuing the experience with a fear of the world's impending demise. And it's actually incredible how much tourism creates this kind of last chance to see something before it disappears narrative, both kind of slotting into and feeding a prevailing sense of living in the end times. So while places like Safranbolu are lovely to visit, no doubt, I have no doubt about that, I think that many examples of tourism, and heritage tourism in particular, are often, in fact, a darker form of tourism than the sites which are overtly known as dark tourism sites, because heritage tourism often promotes a melancholic sense of loss, which in turn creates fear that the world is gradually, or even quickly, perhaps moving towards its demise. And I'll give you a very local example of this. And this is Fiordland, World Heritage Site area right on our doorstep, which is probably considered New Zealand's #1 natural heritage tourism area. But next time you go over there, have a close read of the interpretive signboards at places like Mirror Lakes and the Chasm. Many tourists come here explicitly to experience one of the last paradises on Earth. And yet tourists are given a strong sense that the ecosystem and wildlife here have an uncertain future. So when this Chinese man, for example, goes away and perhaps uses his translation app to be able to understand kind of properly the words in the interpretation panels, he'll read that the forest that once rang with birdsong has now become silent because the native birds are disappearing. And he'll come to understand that the place and its life are on the brink of no return. And clearly, a large part of this narrative is aimed at drumming up support and perhaps donations for the conservation efforts that take place in Fiordland. But there's also an extremely fine line, I think, between creating a story which will generate hope and positive action, and one which simply produces a pessimistic fear for the future, which is what I think much of Fiordland's tourism does. And finally, we get on to hope. Yay! So, yeah, some examples of tourism do present a hope narrative. An example from far away is that sort of described as a sort of hope museum is Robben Island Museum in South Africa, which is described as a museum which purposely mobilizes a hope sensibility among its visitors, not to generate some sort of pleasurable or positive tourism experience, but rather with the deliberate idea that hope is associated with promoting and effecting positive socio-political change. And even in Fiordland, a hopeful narrative can be produced, as Eric Shelton and I observed during research on the narratives presented on trips to Doubtful Sound. During cruises on the Sound, the boat very often, they'll take the boat into a sort of quiet bay, and they turn the boat's engines off and instruct everyone to stay very sort of still and quiet so that they can experience the sound of silence. But depending on the level of the sort of brink of no return narrative being presented by the guide, up until that point, tourists will often experience the sound of silence as the sound of paradise lost, because the focus in that case is on how silent it is because of the loss of birds and their song. Alternatively, if the guide is passionate about the restoration work taking place in Fiordland, they may emphasize how much bird song is coming back. And in this case, tourists can experience the place as a paradise refound or regained, or a narrative of hope. So, because there clearly is a very fragile line or balance between fear and hope, this aspect of my research is about developing understanding about the ways in which tourism tends to often unwittingly feed pessimism and fear, but also how tourism might be able to act as a narrative technique in order to create a hopeful orientation towards the future. So, back to my title, back to start again. I'm going to come to just a few words of conclusion, really, before I say a few thanks afterwards. So my intention when I submitted this title a few weeks ago was to try to convince my audience that tourism matters precisely because it does things in connection with these things, with shame, empathy, fear, and hope. But if I'm honest, I saw this as a bit of a challenge because up until 11 days ago, I wasn't entirely sure how convinced you would be that even these things mattered, because of the largely the dominant thinking that only, for example, GDP and jobs and so on matter, as I talked about earlier. But I think that our world has changed quite substantially since then. And I think that the ground underneath our feet in terms of what matters has shifted somewhat. To say that something matters implies an obligation to pay appropriate attention to it. And I think that over the last week or so, we've moved towards a realization that we do need to pay appropriate attention, that is, more attention, to the matter of, for example, how we wish to live in proximity to others. We've also illuminated our common interest in living ethically and empathetically. And we realize now how vital it is to overcome a pessimistic, fearful mood and to find ways to be hopeful about the possibility of something better. And so if tourism, and indeed any of the areas that we research and teach here at the University of Otago, are in any way connected to these kinds of matters, then I think we can safely say now that they are worth paying appropriate attention to. So, finally, I want to say a big thanks to a few key people who have contributed to my my life, my career. First of all, I think that it's important to thank the German hippie from the Athens from the Athens Youth Hostel. He pushed me to go there and started all of this. I also need to say a massive thank you to many people in Gurame particularly, and elsewhere in Cappadocia, but especially in Gurame. And there are too many people to name there, so I've just put a picture up of Gurame. But I do want to thank particularly Apas and Senem and Paradise Mehmet, as he's called, who really helped me and supported me and cared for me during my PhD field work and since, and they've become great friends over the years. I also want to thank Tammy Cohen, an anthropologist previously at Durham University, now at Melbourne University. She was my PhD supervisor and provided wonderful guidance, support, and friendship. I want to thank all the students and colleagues and co-authors and friends over the year who I'm representing you all here in this multiculturalism image because you've come from all over the place and you've taught me heaps, and so thank you very much. And then of course there's Rob and Liam, the loves of my life. Thank you for keeping me real and giving me a nice work-life balance and so on. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to use your stories tonight, Liam. And last but not least, I want to thank my mum and dad, Carol and Jim Tucker, who are in Scotland. They, of course, provided me with a very loving environment as I was growing up, which then gave me the confidence and sort of allowed me to go forth and go all over the world, which I obviously have. And here I am. And so, yeah, thank you very much, Mum and Dad. And my dad is appropriately, he's always in that position actually, my dad is appropriately holding up a glass, and I think that I will end there, and because that's what we're going to be doing soon, right?
Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name is James Heim, and it's my great pleasure to offer a few words and reflections following Hazel's IPL. Hazel, I first want to say congratulations on a really outstanding presentation. I'm sure everyone here will agree with me that we've really had a very challenging and thought-provoking presentation from Hazel. By way of reflections, I was sitting there reflecting on all sorts of things during Hazel's presentation. One of those things was the fact that it's 30 years exactly since tourism studies was established here at the University of Otago. And tourism studies at Otago was the vision of 3 professors in 3 different departments, one in marketing, one in geography, and one in history. And the vision from the outset was that tourism would be cross-disciplinary, and we'd be a research centre with a very outward-looking focus. And just looking around in the audience right now, I can see colleagues from all sorts of different departments around the university that within our department we've had the great pleasure of collaborating with. And one of the things that I love most particularly about our field of research is that we're very, very collaborative. And I could list all of the different disciplines across the various divisions and departments at the university that we've collaborated with. But in one particular discipline, we've been extremely fortunate, and that is social anthropology, because we've had Hazel in our department. And Hazel brings disciplinary expertise and also methodological expertise to our department that has influenced a generation of researchers and influenced the way many of us think and conduct ourselves as researchers within the department. So in that sense, it's been a great pleasure, of course, to have Hazel's expertise within our department. So thank you, Hazel, for that as well. Other reflections, I'd have to say that one of the most amazing things about Hazel's research is that she has maintained, as you've seen, a focus within her research that has been sustained over not just years, but also decades. And I was also reflecting during her presentation that one of the most special things about her research is that dating right back to a German hippie in 1984, she has maintained a particular focus and a stream of research published in the very top journals in the field that is quite honestly unparalleled anywhere else in the world. In our field, so much of the research that is published is one-off, it's isolated, and it makes individual contributions. But I was reflecting upon Hazel's research program, and it really occurred to me that the University of Otago and the University of Otago receives so much recognition, for example, from the Dunedin study, which dates back to 1972, and young people born in Dunedin in that year and their pathway through life. Hazel's research program within our field very much reflects that, insofar as she has reported tonight on a program of research that not looks at individuals born in a particular year and their life course, but looks at a community, a society, and how tourism has evolved and how that community has evolved over time, over a sustained period of research over years and decades. That is truly outstanding. And the recognition that the university gets from the Dunedin study is actually very similar to the recognition that our department gets from Hazel's research program, which is viewed by many colleagues around the world with very envious eyes because of that sustained and outstanding contribution over time. So congratulations on that as well, Hazel. Hazel has challenged us to think about why tourism matters. And she's challenged us to think at all sorts of levels about shame and empathy and fear and hope. And I'm sure that we'll all go away this evening with lots to think about in terms of her contributions to scholarship. And talking about fear and talking about living in the end times, I'm pleased to say that I was actually on Hazel's appointment panel when she came to Dunedin for the first time to be interviewed. And there were all sorts of reasons why she may have taken up the position that we offered her here at the University of Otago. And in fact, I'm very pleased to say, having sat on that appointment panel, that on several occasions I've been at conferences and meetings elsewhere in the world, and people have said, Hazel Tucker, we really wanted to recruit her when she graduated from Durham. Why on earth did she go all the way to Otago, so far away from her family and so far away from her field site in Gurame in Cappadocia, central Turkey? And I can now reveal one of the clinchers one of the key reasons why she came all the way to live here in Dunedin, because she told me. And when she was here to be interviewed, we showed her around a little bit. And one of our little field visits was to the Otago Peninsula. And on that visit to the Otago Peninsula, she saw a couple of yellow-eyed penguins. And she told me that that was the clincher. That was what convinced her that she wanted to come and live in Dunedin and forge her career at the University of Otago. Of course, the prospects of the yellow-eyed penguin were reasonably grim then, and they're even more grim now, but I hope that the yellow-eyed penguin can be preserved because it does play an important role in recruiting world-class academics to come and work here at the University of Otago. So it's my great pleasure now to be able to pass over a little gift to Hazel on behalf of the university and obviously to offer her our congratulations.